Morning, and welcome to today's Fab Friday presentation. My name is Bruce Jones, and I am a member of the OLLI Fab Friday Committee. Today's speaker is Dr. Marsha Gordon. Dr. Gordon is a professor of film studies at North Carolina State University and is also a National Endowment for the Humanities scholar. Dr. Gordon is co-editor of Screening Race in American Non-Theatrical Films, which was published in 2019 by Duke University Press. Today's presentation will contain material from that book along with supporting film clips. And before I turn the meeting over to Dr. Gordon, I think I should mention that my friend and longtime OLLI member, Nancy Gordon, Marsha's mother, is in the audience, and I'm sure she is proud as always. So with that, we'll send it over to Dr. Gordon for her presentation.
Thank you, Bruce. Hi, Mom. I have given lots of presentations of this material in the past, but this is my first time doing it in this format. So this will be interesting for me. I have done a lot of these live in the before times and at various museums and institutions all over the country. And I have done some online presentations, but today, because video can be so glitchy to deliver, instead of showing you a series of short films, I'm going to show you short clips from some short films as we proceed through this presentation. So I'm going to talk for a while, then show a clip, open up the floor for conversation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them as we go. And then I'm going to talk about the next film and show you a brief clip from that as well. So bear with me and let me know if there are any glitches. You can use the Q&A throughout, and we encourage you, in fact, if you have questions, because I'll be talking about, I think, 7 or 8 different short films as we go. If you have questions or comments that come to mind, please drop them in the Q&A, and I think we'll pause every now and then to answer those questions. So now, it used to be that studying films meant studying Hollywood films, at least in the American context. So these would be feature films made for entertainment. But there's many reasons to go beyond that. And so as a film historian, this is I would say, a relatively new development in the history of the discipline. The past 10 to 20 years, people have really started to think about what was happening outside of movie theaters. My colleague at University of Chicago, Allison Nadia Field, and I co-edited this collection, Screening Race, an American Non-Theatrical Film. And at some point, by the end of this conversation, I hope I'll be able to drop into the Q&A a link to free access to the book. Duke University Press has partnered with Knowledge Unlatched to provide this book at no cost to audiences. And also, many of the films that I'll be talking about today, you can view in full online. There's a link at the Duke University Press website, and hopefully I will also be able to drop that into the Q&A by the end of the presentation, since I'm just showing short excerpts in case you want to go back to it and have a look at any of these films in full. So the goal of this whole project was to think about how ideas about race and ethnicity were imagined outside of mainstream theatrical cinema made in Hollywood. And there's a good reason to want to do that. If you think about how Hollywood has historically represented people of color, it is notoriously bad and notoriously inadequate. If you think about from Westerns to plantation films, just the number of maids and slaves, savages and criminals that Hollywood pushed out to millions of viewers all over the world in their films. This is not what was happening outside of movie theaters. And so this book and today's presentation is going to focus on something that I refer to as non-theatrical films, which obviously are films that were not largely seen in movie theaters, but these are films that would have been seen in churches, in classrooms, in department stores, in workplaces, in community centers, at military training, in museums, and in living rooms in the case of home movies and other reduction prints of these films. And what's interesting about opening up a consideration of film history to these other kinds of films is that these were made by companies large and small all over the country. So you get outside of like what's happening in Hollywood and maybe in New York to films being made in Chicago and in North Carolina, in small towns where you have local regional producers, not to mention all the individuals who had 16, Super 8 and 8mm cameras and were making and documenting their own families and their own lives. This included students. This included women and people of color who were largely excluded from Hollywood. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, there were only 2 women who directed films for feature films for Hollywood. Those were Dorothy Arzner and Ida Lupino. So if you think about even that fact, 2 white women, by the way, if you think about that fact, and then you think about all of the opportunity that was opened up when it wasn't just about control from the top down, you begin to get a really different picture of the kinds of films that were being made and seen by people all over the country. And a kind of astonishing reality of film history is that non-theatrical films, these types of films that I've just mentioned, vastly outnumber the number of commercial films in terms of, not only how many were made, but how many people saw them. I mean, films were a part of everyday life in some ways. There was a time when people saw 16mm films, on a very, very regular basis, much more so ever than theatrical films. So the content of this edited collection that I co-edited with my colleague, Ali, is basically 18 chapters. And I'm going to be drawing some content from an array of these chapters written by different film historians and archivists all over the country. And these range from films made for department stores at the turn of the century that explored Native American life, to a film made by Charles and Ray Eames that's focused on the Day of the Dead in 1957, which I will be showing a clip from today, to a 1960s film about African-American life that was produced by the National Urban League and that was seen by an estimated 4.5 million viewers during its non-theatrical distribution life. And that's just one example, by the way, of how many eyes got on these films. These are not, by and large, films that were, you could write off because nobody saw them. They were films that were really seen and I think really had an influence on the shape of American life. And then there's things like Asian American home movies that have been digitized and that now stream online. And I think in the case of home movies in particular, I'm not going to be showing any today, but there are some that stream from the book's website. These are so important because these are people documenting their own families and their own communities. And if you think about, again, the kind of often malignant representations that Hollywood dished out of non-white subjects, it becomes really important that people were able to capture birthdays and holidays and travels and love and family, and then share that with their communities through their home movies. This type of film, non-theatrical film, has largely been neglected by scholars and has largely been inaccessible to people like you all who are in the audience today. And this has really impacted the way films have been preserved and recognized in archives. There's a few notable exceptions to this, but this is, again, a kind of very recent phenomena of taking films like this seriously. And I think if I were to frame what's to follow with kind of 3 big questions that I think I'm going to try to speak to and that we can have a discussion about, and certainly you may have questions or comments about as we proceed through these films. And I'm going to really focus just on educational films today. One is, who deserves to be seen on screen? So what does it mean to carve out space for people who aren't necessarily getting any attention, or if they are getting attention, pretty demeaning attention on big screens? The second question is, what does America look like? And how is America changing? And the films that are discussed in the book date from the early 1900s to really the early 1980s. I'm going to be looking at a kind of smaller chronology here, really from the 1950s on, but the point is still that America was never a homogenous nation. And so So these films, I think, begin to explore what it means to take that diversity seriously. And then the final question is really, what is the American dream, and who has access to it? This is obviously remains a really important question to think about in terms of race and access to everything: education, fair policing, real estate, and so on. So I will say, I think race has never been easy to talk about, and we are seeing that today in new and important ways. And I think if we think about why many of the films that we're looking about, if not all of them today, maybe with a couple of exceptions, why they were made to open the door to discussion. They were made to figure out a way to help people think about diversity in their communities. And, you know, some are more intentional about this than others, but I do think it's really worthwhile for us now to look back at these films and think about how outside of movie theaters, there were makers, teachers, pastors, et cetera, who were really interested in having these conversations, and especially in getting young people whose minds are not yet fully formed to think about what it means basically not to be white, and also what it means to be a white person in a culture that that privileges that identity. So I know that many of you, if not all of you, grew up watching films like the ones we're going to see clips from today. I'm going to be showing largely films that circulated, or all films that circulated on the educational market. But of course, you may have seen films, you know, in the military, job training films, etc. And I would love, as part of this, for you to share your memories of having that projector turn on in the classroom or in the workplace. Maybe a film will come rushing back to you. I've done a lot of shows, 16mm shows in public, with one of my key collaborators who lives in North Carolina. His name is Skip Elsheimer of AV Geeks. And if you Google him, he sells DVDs, he does online streaming programs every day. And it's amazing how many people have a few films that they remember from when they were, you know, in 5th grade or 7th grade or high school or whatever, because they really imprinted on their minds. And so maybe we can save that conversation for the end. And that will be my big question, is if this brought back any memories of classroom films to you. So I'm going to start today with something that is not mentioned in the book, but I have written about elsewhere, and just show you just the first couple of minutes of this film. And this is an example of an educational film produced in the early 1950s that is doing its best to confront ideas of race and discrimination, albeit it's done rather obliquely and metaphorically. This is a film called Skipper Learns a Lesson from 1952. And as you will tell, even from just this brief excerpt that I'm going to show you, it was really speaking to a white audience and trying to help white kids think about their possible prejudicial beliefs and behavior, and try to get them to think about what it means to accommodate difference. And it does so in, well, in a kind of coy and maybe partly charming, partly ridiculous way, but we'll really be focusing in what follows after this film, and you'll see how this short clip negotiates this, but on non-white racial identities today. But I want to make it clear that obviously whiteness is also a constructed identity, right? It's not like the natural thing, and all of these other things are unnatural. So whiteness is as much a racial identity as anything else. So I'm going to go ahead and just show the first couple of minutes from Skipper Learns a Lesson.
Once upon a time, in a neighborhood pretty much like yours, perhaps, there were some children who played together all the time. There was Betty, Mike, Pete, and Larry. They had lots of fun digging in a vacant lot. One day, a new girl moved into the neighborhood. Her name was Susan, and she had a dog whose name was Skipper. Skipper was a cute little dog, and Susan was very fond of him. She liked to pet him and play with him. She liked to teach him tricks, too. Of course, Skipper loved Susan. He liked to play with her, and he liked to do the tricks she'd taught him. But fond as Susan was of Skipper, she didn't want to play with him all the time. And when the children who lived in the neighborhood came along, she was glad to see them. They invited Susan to play in the vacant lot with them. Larry said, "Come and play with us. We're digging a trench." Mike said, "If you'll come and play with us, you can have one of our shovels." "You should see our trench," Pete said. "It's long and wide and deep, too. We're having fun." "I'd like you to play with us," said Betty. "I've been hoping a girl would move into our neighborhood." "Please come." Susan decided to play with the children. She asked Skipper to come along. But Skipper refused to go. He didn't like the looks of these new children, and he wouldn't play with them.
Okay, so I think you can get the gist of what is happening in Skipper Learns a Lesson just from that brief exchange, right? So we have this tolerant, accepting image of children, and yet it is marred by the racism of the dog. And so this was a way, obviously, to speak to very young children at a point in our history, right? 1952, this is, leading up to Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of schools, to really start to open this conversation through a very disarming, very non-confrontational way, somewhat ridiculous as well. But you can see American films intended for young people starting to at least raise the question of what happens when we integrate our communities, when we integrate our schools. So again, that's kind of just a framing device for what follows, which are much more intentional films focused on non-white communities. And as I said before, if you have comments or questions, feel free to drop them in, and Bruce is going to moderate as we go. So I'm going to start now with a really interesting film from 1957 called The Challenge, which is directed by Claude Bach. And this film is from the University of Southern California Archives. And my collaborator there, Dino Everett, was nice enough to digitize film prints for me so that I was able to share these clips with you today. So I just want to acknowledge him. This is interesting because this is a student film. This is not the only student film we will look at today, but we're going to look at a number of student films. And you'll notice that a number of the films I'm showing today are from California. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is I'm from there, so I have an interest. The second is there were, the most important film schools in the country at the time, University of Southern California and UCLA, had a lot of students who were looking for film subjects, and there was such an active need for films for classrooms that it was very easy as a student, if you made a good film, to actually get distribution on the educational film market because classrooms were so in need of content. So this is a USC student film, and it touches on some really interesting questions of culture and identity for Japanese Americans. From 19th century immigration to the incarceration of Japanese Americans in prison camps during World War II, to the state of the community in Little Tokyo in 1950s Los Angeles. And what's notable about this is that these subjects really receive virtually no attention in film certainly not in Hollywood film, but even in documentary film and classroom film until a lot later. So 1950s is very, very early for this conversation. Keep in mind, you know, World War II ended only in 45, and so this is kind of a new wound to pick to bring up things like the Japanese internment camps, and so in prison camps during the war. So the start of the film, which I'm not showing you, is very upbeat about the success of the Japanese immigrant despite many obstacles. And then there's a shift in tone, including in the music, as the film transitions to talk about more limiting aspects of the Japanese American experience. So I'm going to show you a short clip from that.
So the Japanese drifted into the cities where they opened shops and lived in confined areas. While immigrants of other nationalities found acceptance in growing communities, the Japanese were excluded. They retreated into a little world of their own. The routine of business life provided the only contact with the rest of society. As Superior Court Judge Iso explained,
they had a difficult time first. They couldn't buy property or obtain good jobs, or even attend the same schools as some Americans. They thought the reason they were not accepted was because they were uneducated. So the Issei gave his son, or Nisei, an opportunity to get an education, hoping this would open the doors to opportunity and acceptance. The Nisei was a citizen by birth and an American by choice. But in spite of his political heritage, he often found himself where he was when he began.
the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activity from the The attack caused an immediate distrust of Japanese Americans. Fear of sabotage and collaboration prompted the federal government to move them into assembly centers and then to isolated relocation camps located in the interior of the United States. Life in camp was severe and restricting. But instead of rebelling, the Japanese Americans bore their indignity with grace and understanding. When the hysteria of war had subsided, the federal government began the huge task of investigating the individual backgrounds of the suspected people. Finally, after thorough investigation, they were cleared of suspicion. Eventually, the Niseis were recruited into the armed services of the United States.
I'm from Seattle. After war was declared, I was evacuated from the Pacific Coast. When the call came for volunteers for a combat team, I volunteered from a relocation center to show my loyalty and to prove that I had the right to live as a good American citizen. I'm fighting over here for the better things of life and to preserve the American way of living.
They fought in the spirit of the Japanese American Creed, written in 1941, which said, "Because I believe in America, and I trust she believes in me, and because I have received innumerable benefits from her, I pledge myself to do honor to her at all times."
Okay, so what I find really interesting, I find many things interesting about this film, and again, I encourage you, if you have an interest in these films, to watch them in their entirety. This is one that streams online, and again, I'm happy to share that link, is that it begins to get at this question of what it means to be an American, right? And this is one path of these films, one arm of these films, is really thinking about the relationship between assimilation and separatism, maintaining some kind of a distinct culture. And this film is really begins to express the idea of the model minority Japanese American, which is problematic in its own right. I'm not holding that up in a positive way, because it's an idealization and a romanticization, right? So on the one hand, you have the acknowledgement in the narration of the fact that these were, these were prison camps with difficult conditions. And on the other hand, you have this attempt to represent the patriotic, hardworking, forgiving Japanese Americans who were not radicalized, not pushing back against an unfair system. And this would become more relevant as we get into the 1960s and we think about the way Black separatism was dealt with in films like this. So I also want to point out that one of the things that this film does that's really interesting to me is use that direct address of people talking to the camera. So you have the judge and you have the two soldiers who are basically convincing you of the essential kind of qualified goodness, patriotism of the Japanese in the face of discrimination, right? So I think this film begins to get at some really interesting ideas that in particular, I think teachers needed ways to breach these subjects with their students. And this gave them a way to kind of open the door to those conversations and to talk about America's flaws. So this is not also idealizing America.
Dr. Gordon?
Yes.
We have a comment.
Okay.
Barbara Robinson, one of my uncles married a Japanese woman who was interned during the war. Surprisingly, she did not have negative, lasting feelings about it.
Yeah, well, I do know from having talked to people who work at the Japanese American Museum and were part of putting that together, which is in California, that of course, as with anything that a group of people experience, the range of reactions is going to be different, right? Some people are going to want to get past it and put it behind them. And some people are going to have resentment for their treatment. And certainly all of those reactions and everything in between are completely understandable. But this was, of course, a complete disruption of people's lives, taking their livelihood, their property in some cases away, and limiting their freedoms and disenfranchising them in every way just because of their national identity.
Okay, great. And Barbara Robinson also mentions that the Flower Drum Song musical in 1958 was one of the first Hollywood movies with Japanese actors.
Yeah, well, the history of actors of color in Hollywood is, I mean, this is a whole other talk, but and then what those actors, what kind of roles they were able to play, right? So yeah, again, that's a whole other talk, but that's a great observation. So thank you, Barbara, for sharing that. I appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next film and our last film from the 1950s. And this is a good one. It's Day of the Dead, directed by the Eameses, Charles and Ray Eames. So although United States interest in Mexican art and culture has a very long history, including a 1920s vogue for Mexican travel and art collecting, when this film was produced and released in 1957, Day of the Dead was basically an unknown phenomena in the United States. We all know what Day of the Dead is now, right? We can all picture iconography from it. That was not the case in the 1950s. So this film that I'm going to show you a brief clip from was funded by the International Museum of Folk Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to the tune of $12,000, modest budget. And the museum itself was greatly influenced by the designer and folk art collector Alexander Girard, who donated 100,000 pieces of folk art from around the world to the Museum of Folk Art. So this is like the founding collection, and Girard had worked with the Eameses at Herman Miller. Now the Eameses directed many, I think it was 100 films between 1950 and the late 1970s. Some people just know them as these influential mid-century designers, which they were, but they were also incredible experimental and art filmmakers. And Charles Eames had actually traveled to Mexico for 9 months in 1933 during the Depression, where he sold paintings and he started his own collection of Mexican folk art. So he had this kind of 20+ year prior history of spending time learning about Mexican culture and Mexican art. So the film I'm going to show you a clip from circulated widely at film and art festivals, on university campuses, at museums, and not surprisingly, given its makers, it was really focused on folk art and decorations central to the holiday, but also on the people that made and used them. So I'm going to show you a very brief clip from this film.
When it is late in October, many fields in Mexico are filled with yellow flowers, wild marigold, the cempasúchil. In Mexico, both the season and the flower are symbols of death. But the attributes of death, which the cempasúchil represents, are for most Mexicans neither morbid nor sentimental. In Mexico, an intimate acceptance of death extends far back into pre-Hispanic times. In the Aztec culture which preceded the coming of the Spaniard, death shows itself again and again, a familiar image. These ancient things of this land were joined over the centuries with the Spanish celebration of All Souls. Together they form a universal festival of many facets and many dimensions, the Day of the Dead. The skulls of this Aztec codex are not unlike the sugar ones that appear in each Mexican marketplace toward the end of October, in preparation for the day when the dead return and are welcomed by the living. The changing moods of a town's marketplace anticipate each coming holiday. The Day of the Dead is preceded by its own rich flood of special objects. The form can change from state to state, from small village to large city. The interpretation of the celebration will not be the same among Indians as it is among those of Spanish descent. But through all these changes runs a strong, consistent thread. The aim of this film is to recall this thread through the objects that are part of the celebration, by showing the way they are made, sold, and used. It is a rich folk art, and the people that produce it are the same as the people that will buy and use it. Their homes are the same, and they have the same personal involvement in the celebration itself.
Okay, so first off, this is a very beautiful film. I mean, you really get immersed in the beauty of the art being made and the colors and the celebration and the culture. In that way, this is an ethnographic film, right? So you can tell already, as with The Challenge, something I forgot to mention, that the narrator has this very Anglo voice, right? This is an outside observer who's talking about, most Mexicans do this. This is not somebody from within the community who's telling the story, right? So this is somebody who is looking from the outside. What this film does is really to celebrate and admire Mexican culture and tradition, right? Which is important given a lot of the anti-Mexican sentiment that has historically taken place in the United States and that flourishes, as we all know, from contemporary discourse about the wall and about immigration to the present day. And this really contrasts, I think, nicely, the film I'll end the program with, if I have enough time to get to it, this contrasts nicely with the story that's told in that. But what I find interesting about this film in relationship to some of the others that are talked about in the collection, there's a whole chapter dedicated to this film in the book. What I find interesting about it is that it's not about tensions between cultures. It's not about race in the way of like, here is a category of person, and we're trying to figure out how to understand the relationship between the races, between the cultures. It's really just about celebrating this tradition by taking it seriously as an artistic and cultural practice. I also want to say about this film that this was a very influential film in terms of Chicano artists who in the 1970s started adopting Day of the Dead iconography. And if you think about it, right, how did you learn about things like this in the 1950s and 1960s, right? You didn't Google them. So 16 millimeter films had the ability to really influence, if they were widely seen, to influence artists, to influence students, to influence teachers. And so this is one way that the study of this kind of material gives us a kind of sense of what the roots are of things like the kind of prolific interest in Day of the Dead and awareness about it today, right? Which when Disney makes films or Pixar makes films about a holiday, it's in the culture. Okay. So with that, I'm going to move on to my next film, unless I need to be interrupted by Bruce with a question. So if not, I will talk about, this is the centerpiece to me of the collection. Although we don't write as extensively about it here, but I have published extensively on this film. This is probably the most important film that I have, quote unquote, discovered. And I say that in quotes because obviously this film was made, shown prolifically, and then just got a little buried in an archive, and it's called Felicia. And I want to tell you how I found it, which is Skip Elsheimer, the AV geek who lives in Raleigh, who's a 16 millimeter film collector and exhibitor, showed me this film when I was doing research for a project. So he's really the one who discovered it in his collection. And I was so stunned by what an amazing document this film was that I said to myself, I have to write about it one day. So a couple things about the film. It was directed by 3 white UCLA students, 2 who were European immigrants to the United States, Bob Dixon, Alan George, and Trevor Greenwood. And it was a student film, even though it was not made by them as a class project. So it was not a student film in the sense that it was an assignment. It was a student film in the sense that they were students. They had access to UCLA equipment that they may or may not have been allowed to use for projects outside of school. And they wanted to make a meaningful film about segregated Los Angeles in the 1960s. And so what they did was they reached out to a teacher friend of theirs and asked if they had any students of color who they thought were likely to be good kind of interview subjects to tell the story of how geographically segregated Los Angeles was. And their teacher friend immediately said, yes, there's this young woman, Felicia Bragg, she's extraordinary. So the filmmakers, so imagine these 3 white UCLA filmmakers, go to Watts, the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, which was predominantly African-American at the time, and start talking to the mother of this young girl, and who was very skeptical, as of course you would be. 3 white UCLA students, male students, coming to ask if they can spend time with your daughter to tell the story of your community. But they spent time with her, and she began to trust them and gave them her permission to make this film. So this is a day in the life film. The total runtime is only 13 minutes. So this is one that I would encourage you to see in its entirety. I'm going to show you 2 brief clips. I couldn't restrict myself to one. It's really a day in the life documentary. And so the way they made this film was they first recorded Felicia just talking to them. They just did a series of interviews about her life. And then they filmed after the fact, Felicia kind of going through her day in a kind of semi-staged way, right? Because they weren't just, fly on the wall observing. It gives the appearance of that, but they had to, be there for, for when she was at home and when she went to school, et cetera. So I know much of this because I interviewed the filmmakers, all three of them, and Felicia in person as part of doing research for this project. And that was a pretty extraordinary experience. First, because they were so astonished, gobsmacked, could not believe that anybody would care about this film that they made in the 1960s when they were students so long ago, and then bothered to track them down and take the time to interview them. But then also because of what came out of it afterwards, and I'll talk about that after I show you the clips. Before I show you these two clips, I want to say that this film is what it is because of its amazing narrator, who is just an extraordinarily articulate young woman growing up in this neighborhood, who has a kind of self-awareness and an awareness about why Watts was the neighborhood that it was, that was so beyond her years. I certainly didn't have her maturity or her self-awareness when I was her age. So I will show you these two clips and then come back.
My name is Felicia. I'm a junior in high school. This is my bedroom where I was born, and I've lived here all my life with my mother and my sister and my brother. Peter's the oldest. And Peter's that type that if he can't have it, all of it, he doesn't want part of it. So I guess that's why he quit school, because he thought he could do better on his own. He has very high IQ, but he's just lazy. But I think now he's coming to his senses, and he knows that he just can't do it without an education. Peter and I are only a year apart, and then Rosie and I are 3 years apart. She's the quietest one. She's the one my mother babies the most. She's the one we all have to take care of. I guess we get along pretty well because we don't fool around with each other that much. She goes her way and I go mine. She's pretty smart too. She got straight A's on her last report card. She's not like me and Peter. Like homework and stuff, I let it go to the last minute. But she doesn't. She comes home and she does it right away. Now that's something I definitely wouldn't do. And Peter definitely wouldn't do. My mother is the sole support of the family. She takes care of us good. Always worries about us. Sometimes it gets a little, you get bugged and she's always telling you, do this, do that. She's just like any other mother, I guess. Only she's had it a little tougher because she's been the only one to take care of us. And it's like a father and a mother. People bring her clothes and material, and she makes her dresses. She gets money for that. And then my neighbor lets her babysit when she goes to work a couple of days out of the week. In the daytime when we're gone to school, she does some sewing. And then at night after we go to bed, she stays up till about 2 or 3 o'clock. She works all the time. She wanted to go to college, but her father died and he wanted her to go to college. But her mother was that kind that thought the daughter's place was at home and all she needed to know was how to cook. She just finished high school. She didn't have enough education to get a high-paying job. She wants us all to go to college with everything she missed. She wants us to have.
And this is the second clip.
I know they need some place to have those things, but they don't have to have them right behind houses. How would you like to have a bunch of cars right in your backyard? So what if some kids get out there playing and they pile one car too high and it comes crashing down and there's no place for it to crash but right into the yards? And I think that's dangerous, and I don't see why the city allows it to be like that. Those people, even if they are living in a run-down neighborhood, that still isn't any reason for them to have to live with stuff like that right at their back door.
Okay, hopefully you can understand why this is my personal favorite film, even from those two short clips, personal favorite film discussed in the collection. I think Felicia's, well, there are so many things that are extraordinary about this film. And again, I've published so extensively on this, it's hard to distill just a couple of points, but one is, I love how organically the message of her family's industry and ambition and lack of opportunity is laid out. It's laid out so concisely. It's laid out just so plainly. And it's so absolutely spot on. And again, its relevance, I think today is kind of astonishing if you think about it. I think her ability to talk about environmental and geographic racism, terms that we would not have used in the 1960s, but that she is observing in the layout of her community and articulating and complete feelings of inexplicability for why this is allowed. Why are people allowed to live with these environmental threats? She's really questioning throughout the film, and she points out that she's, rarely had encounters with white people in schools, right? She's talking about school segregation. When she ends up talking about the one time she went to summer school at a predominantly white school, how she would try to talk to some of the white kids outside of the classroom. They were fine to her in the classroom, but that nobody, of the white students would interact with her. And she also talks about the fact that they all presumed that they were going on to college, whereas she wasn't sure whether she would or not. So all of these presumptions about race and geography really get aired out in this film. And another kind of extraordinary aspect of it is that it was filmed in the spring of 1965 in Watts, before the rebellions took place that summer, which kind of forever changed the way Watts would be imagined and understood. And so this film was marketed to teachers when it was circulating later in 1965 and beyond as a way to talk about what happened in Watts, and to do so not from a position of violence and anger, but from this kind of calm, kind of intellectualizing of the situation. And I think what's so special about the film is that, it's Felicia, right? It's this young woman's ability to talk about race and class and geography as it relates to privilege and opportunity and entrapment. So I will say that one of the questions when I show this film in public, which at public events, which I've done, more times than I can count at this point, because it's one that I discovered early in this process, and it's such a it's so well done, and it's so well received by audiences, is people always ask, well, what happened? Did she go to college? And the answer is yes. She went to UC Santa Barbara. She talks about the fact that she was one of a handful of students of color when she went, and it was a struggle. It was a pretty segregated campus as they tried to desegregate in the 1960s, but she made it through and got that college degree. And so that's kind of an extraordinary after story. The final thing I'll say about it is that my colleague Ellie Field at University of Chicago and I nominated the film to the National Film Registry in 2014 successfully. So the Library of Congress picked this film to prioritize for preservation and acknowledged it as a significant film. And the Academy of Motion Pictures Film Archive, related to the Academy Awards, actually restored a 16mm print of this film. So the happy ending to all of this is that through this kind of research and conversation, this film now at least has been cared for the way that so many theatrical films before it have.
Hey, Dr. Gordon, we have a couple of questions. You anticipated the one about the future of Felicia, but they also asked, how is the rest of the family? Do you know how the brothers and sisters made out?
Yeah, not as well. I will say the bright story is that that after all of those years of hard work, Felicia's mother ended up being able to travel, and Felicia talked about her having this incredible experience in her later years of getting to kind of reclaim some of the opportunities she lost being a single mother who had sole support of the family. And I want to make one other kind of point about this, which is related to her mother, which is her mother was Mexican and her father was African American, but the film was marketed as being about the Black experience. So really kind of erased her multiracial identity. And obviously there was a reason for that, right? Which is in the mid 1960s, the thing that people were most concerned about in cities was civil unrest that was pinned to the Black community, especially by the media. So just a side note.
And the second question, how aware were the filmmakers of racism when they made the movie?
That's a great question.
Aware? How did they become so?
Yes, they were very aware. So all of these students were very involved in CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, which was a civil rights activist organization that is still ongoing today. And they set out to make this film because they felt that they wanted to use their privilege to help people understand their city, basically. And so actually Alan George, all three of them continued their work in film. Alan George in particular continued to make really interesting activist, very socially aware documentaries. He lived in Venice at the time. Venice Beach is now, this very desirable, very expensive place to live. In the 1970s, it was the other ghetto. So it was Watts and Venice in Southern California. And Alan lived in that community throughout his life and made other films about Venice and about these questions about race. And so, yeah, thank you for that question. I'm glad you asked. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next film, which is Sumi Wong, Who Shall I Be? And we're going to go in a different direction now. First off, we're in 1970. This is one of 10 films that was distributed by the Learning Corporation of America, which was one of the major educational film distributors. And they had a series called Many Americans that was meant for classrooms. And it typically took an ethnic minority child, usually of immigrant parents who are closely identified with their nation of origin, and then thinks through what happens when they have children who are kind of split between that original ethnic identity and their American identity. And in this case, this film was shot on location in Los Angeles' Chinatown. And I think it's very interesting the way that it imagines Chinese spaces and Chinese ideas versus American spaces and American ideas. And it's also participating in this ongoing discussion that we see surfacing in The Challenge. In some ways, it kind of might be alluded to in Day of the Dead. It's certainly so in Felicia, the question of assimilation and exclusion as well. And the study guide for this film, every film that was distributed to a classroom had a study guide that came with it. So if you were ever taught an educational film, which I'm assuming most of you were, your teacher had access to a bunch of study questions that were prepared usually by an expert. Sometimes they were in fact psychologists or sociologists. Other times it was just people at the production company. And this study guide asks, what does a child have to give up to be an American? So this was the question, one of the questions that would be used in the post-screening discussion. And you can tell even from the framing of that question, what it's asking young people to think about. Before I show you this clip, I want to mention that some of the cinematography here, as with Felicia, which is really beautifully shot, is really good, and especially some of the moving footage. And I'm not showing you a long clip from this film, so you won't get to see that much of it, but it was photographed by Caleb Deschanel, who went on to be the photographer, cinematographer of The Black Stallion and Being There and The Right Stuff, Passion of the Christ. He's the father of Zoe Deschanel. And I make that point because a lot of future Hollywood talent, directors, producers, cinematographers, editors, cut their teeth in educational film because you couldn't just go to Hollywood and get a job, editing. This was a way to get real world experience and to build up a resume. So I'm going to show you just a brief scene in which the intergenerational and cultural conflict of the film is established.
Con sao mình đến điều gì à?
Mừng ba thì năm mừng ba.
Con cho hôm mới đi thứ ba rồi à?
Anh đi phong học翻嚟，你有翻去紅娛樂考學試啊嘛？
但係我想跳舞啊！
你去小白人會唔翻學呢？都係撤退正常教學，你為你進攻營嘅傳統性噶咯。
但係我係住喺美國啊！
都係雖然係只有美國啊，你都要學訓進攻營嘅文化嘅學士講得嘅。
Okay, so I think this film, you can get at the nut of it just from that short clip. I think it gets at some really interesting and hard questions, right? About cultural preservation and assimilation. I can imagine young people having really interesting ideas and points to make about the film as it proceeds, and just so, you know, the father does eventually end up allowing Sumi to pursue ballet. It's kind of his concession to kind of wanting her to have a place in the world outside of their kind of closed Chinese space. And this is, I think, also the idea that the film is advancing, that it's important to think about these relationships. And you kind of get at some of this even in the layout of their apartment, which is, you know, you have Sumi's bedroom, which reflects her hybrid identity, right? She's got her pictures of ballet dancers, and you hear the Western classical music, and you hear the Chinese music, and then there's the breakfast table with the extended family speaking at first Chinese that is untranslated, right? So it's only when Sumi sits down and eating Chinese cuisine, it's only when Sumi sits down that the film translates what's being said. And the next scene actually after this is the living room, not unlike in Felicia, where the father this time is laboring as a tailor. So the film establishes these ideas. This is fiction film, right? This is not documentary. This is fiction film, but it's getting at those same kinds of questions about cultural identity and about what this generation of Chinese American wants to pursue and where she wants to spend her time and energy. Okay, Bruce, if there's not questions, I will continue.
No, we're good.
Okay. Okay, so the next film is from 1970 as well. It's called Cotton Eye Joe. And this is a really different kind of film than what we've been looking at. This also comes from the USC archives. And it was shot by another student, this one named John McDonald, and this was his senior thesis film. So unlike Felicia, which was made outside of the classroom, this was a classroom film. This is a very stylized, experimental day in the life film. So in that, it shares that with Felicia, about Joseph Wagner, who lived in a makeshift encampment near Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles. So he was a real subject. This is a real documentary with some experimental and reenactment aspects. So I met with John, the filmmaker, on several occasions, and he actually attended the book release event that I did for this book at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, where we showed this film. And he also is still a very socially engaged filmmaker. So it's interesting how many of these student filmmakers actually ended up keeping with this. So McDonald first encountered as a student Joe's encampment when he was location scouting near Elysian Park, and he got to know him over the course of a couple of years. And then by the time he was a senior, he asked if he could make a film about his life. In the middle of making the film, Joe was sentenced to 2 months in prison for vagrancy, and so he had to suspend the shoot. And actually, he and his advisor tried to advocate and help Joe out, but they couldn't, so they had to wait to do the shoot. You will see, even in this short clip, that what the filmmaker is doing is much more experimental art film. So it's really doing much more of a hybrid, as opposed to a very clear, friendly for young student kind of film. You would not have shown Cotton Eye Joe to elementary school or junior high schoolers, but maybe you would show it to high school or college students. And actually, this film got a lot of traction on the festival circuit, playing all over the world, and was shortlisted for an Academy Award for Best Short Film. It had got an actual LA Times review in which Charles Champlin, who was one of the big critics of the 1970s for the paper, called it an eloquent wordless documentary. And indeed, there is not a single word spoken in this film. Everything that you see or everything that you learn about this individual is told visually. And the short scene I'm going to show you takes place just after Joe has left his encampment to sell blood, which is how he made money. He would go sell his blood on a regular basis. And what you see in the film happens while he's gone, and then it's his return to the camp.
And Dr. Gordon, we did have a couple of questions on the last film clip.
Sure.
Okay, one is, do you know who the dancer was? They suggested it might be Maria Tallchief.
I have no idea. And no one's ever asked that. And I don't know who Maria Tallchief is. I don't know anything about dance, but I will look it up, and I will say this: this is one of the films that streams. So at the end of the talk, again, I'll cue somebody, and I'll put the links in. You can go look at the film, and you can pause it online, and then maybe you can blow it up and let me know if you figure out who it is.
And the other comment was, my bi-ethnic grandchildren went to Japanese school on weekends when they lived in California 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is right. This is a question. Yeah, none of these questions are resolved, right? Like how much of your time and energy should be spent on your roots versus this idea of America, which, by the way, the idea of America changes all the time, right? I mean, we wouldn't be talking about this in the same way in 1850 or 1900 or 1950 and today, right? So in the 1970s, that question of assimilation was really at the fore, and I think the question of retaining aspects of your generational, your family culture were really being articulated for the first time and advocated for the first time, as opposed to just, you should melt in and just become part of this, fantasy of American melting pot, which was really become, waspier. So yeah, thank you. Okay. I will go ahead and play this clip.
Where do you come from? And where do you go? Where do you come from? My cotton-eyed Joe.
Okay. Many of you probably recognize that that was Nina Simone from her Live at Carnegie Hall album, and McDonald told me that he fell in love with her music, and USC actually got him permission to use the song, which would never happen today, by the way. That would not happen. So the scene that we just looked at together, which seems a little bit contrived maybe, is actually a reenactment of something that Joe told the filmmaker John happened to him when he was out giving blood, that his home was vandalized at Christmas. And so McDonald basically got some kids who were playing nearby to act out a version of what happened. And I really love that moment where John has the shot of them making eye contact through that shot reverse shot, and this moment of kind of shame that the kid obviously experiences, and Joe just kind of looking at him. And what I like about this film in the context of this conversation we've been having today is that it's not a film about assimilation or achievement. It's really not a film in a lot of ways about race, right? It's about a man who chooses to live on the margins of society, and it's that issue of his identity is not the same as in the other films that we are looking at today. And just for the sake of time, unless there's a question, and is there a question, Bruce?
We're good.
Okay, I'm gonna just rush to the last film because I wanna leave time for Q&A at the end and for hearing if this triggered any memories of watching educational films in your past. The final film I wanna say a couple things about is called A Sense of Community, and it's from 1976. And this is another USC student film. And so here's the scenario. You have an assignment to make a 5-minute documentary. Well, what can you do in 5 minutes? So this film student, Jeremy Lesin, made this his first documentary about a church-run sewing operation that was located just a few blocks from the USC campus that was staffed by undocumented workers from Mexico. And I interviewed Jeremy, who now runs a car wash. So that was a hard person to track down, and he was also kind of astonished about why anybody would be looking for him all these years later for a film that he made as a student, and thought that nobody had seen for a really long time. And he basically told me that he was interested as a student in this idea of homework, where garments were made by workers for sub-minimum wages. And when he went and saw it for the first time, he recognized that it was basically a sweatshop, but it was farmed out in a way that the perpetrators couldn't get caught very easily. And so he was told about this operation, that these shirts were being made for JCPenney's and for Woolworths in the basement of the church. And Lesin met the pastor of the church, who was very proud and boastful about providing what he said was a living wage for immigrants, and he boasted that he even offered them housing on the premises. And Jeremy said that when the pastor toured him around, he got a very different perspective on what he was seeing. And so he started by interviewing workers on their days off and outside of the church. And he learned that their reality was really different than the one that the pastor was describing, because they were never offered any opportunities. They lived and worked on the property, and they were locked in during the day. And there's a scene at the beginning of the film where you see the pastor locking this gate. And in point of fact, he said it was to keep anyone out who shouldn't be coming, but in point of fact, it was chaining them in. And basically, as Jeremy told me, and then on Sundays, he expected them to give money back to the church. And this is only a 5-minute film. But I'm not going to show you the whole thing just for the sake of time. I want to leave space. I know it's a beautiful day to be sitting inside in front of your computer. So I'm just going to show the first couple of minutes of this film and then come back and say a couple things about it.
My name is Noé Falconi. I am in charge of the church religious services. Also, I am in charge with the sewing center program. we used to preach that we poor people, we have to suffer, and then when the time comes, we are going to walk in golden streets, and we are going to be happy there. We have to start being happy here on the earth, and now we are providing not only job for the people, but training for them.
The pastor spoke with us. He said that if we were asked questions, we should say that we worked for a community that helped people that didn't know how to work. He wanted me to say that we were helping and teaching, but it isn't true. I'm a seamstress, and although I have the most experience, I don't have the time to teach.
They are learning here how to use the single needle machine and other machines that we can use in the sewing factories, and they are earning more money than they used to earn.
They leave making the same that they did when they started. The ironer makes $9 a day. I take home $67 for 40 hours work. No one goes outside to look for work. No one complains to the union or even the pastor. If we take a day off, we are fired.
Okay, I think you can get the gist of what's going on based on that. So I think that the way, I mean, again, I find it so extraordinary that some of these filmmakers, are, in their young 20s and felt this sense of urgency. I mean, these were documentary projects, so they had to be based in the real world, but felt this sense of urgency to tell stories of the kind of wrongs and the inequities they saw in their communities. And in this case, kind of the really brilliant way of doing that by interweaving the pastor's version with the worker's version, and making labor and exploitation of labor visible, and thereby giving voice to the disempowered. And I think if we look at these works collectively, hopefully you get a sense of how rich this territory is. I mean, this, I can assure you, I had 150 films that are mentioned or discussed in the book to choose from for today, and I didn't even necessarily choose, except in the case of Felicia, my favorite or the best or whatever that means. I just wanted to pick a sampling for you. So hopefully you begin, and this is just really within the realm of the educational film as well, right, and documentary. So hopefully this begins to give you a sense of why this is such interesting territory. And if somebody would be so kind, Mom, would you mind putting in the chat box, please put link or just the word link? I can answer then in the question by dropping the link to both the free access to the book as well as to the streaming content. And that way, those of you who are interested can have a look at it later. And I think at this point, I would just like to open it up for any questions you have, but also I would really love if you have memories of watching films like this. I mean, even if they're not about the subject of race, because this is just one category, I would be more than happy to have those comments from you in the chat. And thank you for your time on this beautiful day.
Hey, Dr. Gordon, can you get to your Q&A window now? Or
I am here. I'm at the Q&A window.
Okay. And I think you just saw a post by this woman, Nancy Gordon. Did you see?
Oh, there it is. I'm going to answer live, and I'm going to put in, oh, okay, the link. Huh, it says you would like to answer this question live. I guess I don't know how to answer. I thought I did. Type answer, I'm sorry. Okay, so the first thing is the link to the open access. And, oh, does everyone see the answer or did it disappear?
I think it disappeared. Don't quite know why.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe what we can do is, Bruce, maybe when you send out your follow-up, we can include the link to the streaming content but if you actually, the easiest way to do this is if you just go to the Duke University Press website for the book, which you can do by putting into your search engine, Duke University Press screening race. If you scroll down, you'll see stream to the link to the streaming content for all of the chapters. And if you go there, you can go to the complete versions of these films. I think only one of the ones I showed you today is not on there in full, so you can see the rest of them in full.
Okay, do we have anything else as far as comments or questions?
Often the films that that people remember when we ask audiences live about this are the anti-drug films, because those were the most entertaining, or the driver's ed films, because those typically were meant to scare you to death. So they were rather gory and horrific. And having watched a bunch of them as an adult, I can say they really did try to scare you, both the drug and the car films, and the driving films. But those are often the ones that are most memorable, just because they happened. You probably saw them when you were a teenager, you know, if you saw them, and because of their kind of extreme nature.
Okay, I don't see anything else coming in. Anything you want to talk about for a few minutes before we wrap it up here?
Well, I mean, I will just say that I think the value to me of doing research in this area is that it's a reminder of how long people have really been trying to have some of these really hard conversations about what it means to be an American. And I think the relevance of so many of these films is that they were asking questions that we still need to ask. They're trying to inspire conversations that we still need to have. I mean, when I have been with audiences and shown Felicia, you know, there is this sense that, like, why haven't people listened? You know, why haven't people fought harder to make our society more equitable, and to give, you know, everyone the opportunities that they deserve for education and for success? And I mean, we've just come out of 4 years of the sense of, you know, kind of righteous disequilibrium about race and equity. And so I think these films are worth listening to, and bear very much on our current society.
And if you check your Q&A window, you may see a few comments at the very end.
Yeah, I see Martha. What changed in mainstream Hollywood that caused documentaries to become more accessible? That's a great question. I'm assuming what you mean by that question, Martha, I could be wrong, is that why are documentaries getting basically theatrical releases, and they take up such a more significant share of theatrical releases? Although, what does a theatrical release mean anymore? Because in the pandemic, of course, everything has gone to streaming. There's not an easy answer to that, except that I'll just offer a couple of ideas about that. I mean, one is that you had a kind of a run. I'm going to use Michael Moore as an example. He's just one of many who were making these films that were documentaries that really resonated with audiences and got box office. I mean, the crassest and most honest thing I can say about Hollywood then, I mean, always, and to the present day, is that it's a business. it's there to make money. It's not about righting wrongs, and it's not about, you know, art in any pure sense, even though you can right wrongs and you can make art as part of that system, and that has always been the case. But once documentaries started making money and really kind of had traction with audiences and could compete with fiction filmmaking, I think it made the studios more open to distributing those films. And if you think about what it costs to make a superhero movie versus what it costs to make a documentary, I think you have another answer, equally crass and commercial, right? Which is that documentaries are relatively cheap. You know, if they are, you know, bringing in, you know, if they cost a 20th of a big budget feature film, but bring in 25% of what that big budget feature film, fiction film makes, you've done, you know, a great job with your bottom line. And so I think that there's been a kind of commercial viability. And I also think that various outlets like PBS, like HBO, really allowed filmmakers who were working in documentary to have an audience, and film festivals, which have also proliferated, as you all know, right? I mean, kind of started off, you know, you had Cannes and then you had Sundance, and now there's thousands of film festivals that really gave filmmakers who were working in the documentary form to have an audience, and that led to distribution. So there's this whole kind of cycle. But that's a great question, and there's no like single answer to that. And Martha, I saw you also had a follow-up about any of the filmmakers continuing to be filmmakers and make documentaries. And I would say in almost all cases, the answer was yes. Bob Dixon, who was one of the Felicia filmmakers, actually ended up working at the Academy of Motion Pictures as a film preservationist. So he did not continue making films, but both Alan George and Trevor Greenwood continued filmmaking, and up until fairly recently, Trevor actually taught filmmaking still at USC, which is pretty cool. So yes, many of them continued in this work. Some didn't. Like I gave the example of Jeremy, who owned a car wash or owns a car wash. But you know, it's interesting because I think the impulse to tell stories that are based in the real world as part of a kind of activist agenda, I mean, it lends itself so well to the form of filmmaking and documentary. And it's really shifted because obviously that whole kind of context of films being used in the classroom is really different now than it was in the 1960s and 1970s, when there was federal money put to the service of film education in the classroom. This really had roots in the 1950s with our science race against the Russians, and an act passed in 1958, I believe, called the National Defense of Education Act, that was passed because we needed to get more science and technology films in the classroom. And then as the infrastructure of 16mm projectors was assumed in classrooms all over the country, then money went to things like racial equity and to encourage films about diversity and multiculturalism in the 1960s and 1970s. And so that was kind of a natural way for people who cared about these issues to figure out a way to make films that could actually be seen and used and actually make money, even if it were not, you know, on a Hollywood scale. So.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. And again, I'd like to thank you for giving an excellent presentation here. And if any of our participants have any subjects they would like to hear about in future Fab Friday talks, you can certainly feel free to contact either me or some of the other committee members, Barbara Griswold, Martha Marshall, Jane Yokoyama, and Sue Kibler. So, you know, if there are no further questions, I think we're probably going to wrap it up for the day here. And again, thank you very much. That was a great presentation.
Thank you all for spending part of your beautiful day with me. And I hope you take the time to see a couple of these films if they intrigued you, and have a good weekend.
Okay, bye-bye.